joining me now is Jonathon Van Maren. And Jonathon is an author. You've written 3 books?
3, yes.
And Jonathon was in town last week for the Estevan and Area Pro-Life Banquet that was held last Wednesday. And I heard that it was a wonderful time.
It always is.
Yeah. So great that you could come in to speak at the banquet. And tell us a little bit about that, first of all. How was the banquet?
The banquet went very well. People are always very enthusiastic. It's always really encouraging to see this many people show up at an event like this. And it's just a really good time to spend with other people, talk about the pro-life message, and then you really get the opportunity to leave feeling invigorated.
Nice. So that's what you talked about, though. You were the guest speaker, and you were speaking on pro-life, and that's what your books have to do with, right?
Yeah.
Kind of educating us on some of the things that a lot of people don't really know as far as that goes.
Yeah, so my speech talked about both the really negative things in our culture and then ended on a very positive note to explain some of the things that we're doing to combat those negative influences. So first, I talked a lot about the impact pornography is having on our society, because pornography is at this point so pervasive that it's even being recognized by secular governments around the Western world as a threat so corrosive it needs to be confronted.
Wow.
So even the House of Commons commissioned, with all-party support, the Standing Committee on Health to research the links between pornography and sexual violence. Right? When even the House of Commons is noticing that this is a problem that needs to be addressed, we should all really be waking up and taking a look at this problem.
I guess so. And I suppose, like with the internet, as good as the internet is, and it has so many positive aspects, but that really is a negative thing, that it can spread the pornography and those ideas so rapidly and to such a huge audience right around the world.
Well, let me give you a very scary statistic. In 2016, Pornhub, which is the main conglomeration of porn sites, released their statistics. And so if you add up all the hours of pornography into days, the days into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years, in that year alone, more than 500,000 years worth of pornography was consumed, which equals roughly about 12 porn videos for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth.
Wow.
This is a cultural plague that is so pervasive that it affects the lives of every single person, whether or not they're aware of it, and awareness is key on this issue.
For sure. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who don't even know that that's out there, but they're coming in contact with people who do every single day.
Well, very much so. So back in the day, if you wanted to look at pornography, right, you had to drive to a corner store and disguise yourself so nobody would know what you were buying, and then you'd have to hide the magazine because you didn't want people to know you were looking at it. Now, any kid with a tablet, a phone, a laptop, access to any device that can take Wi-Fi, can be logged on to pornography that is so repulsive it would be unrecognizable to a previous generation in mere seconds.
Wow. Scary. Yeah. It's scary when you think, you go out and you see 7, 8, 9-year-olds. They all have the cell phone in their hand, and they all know how to use them.
The youngest child I met who was hooked on pornography was only 9 years old. He'd started earlier. No, that was right here on the prairies, actually. The average age of kids that are hooked on pornography that I talked to at high school said they started looking around grade 6.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, and kids are curious.
Yeah.
Kids are curious, and it used to be you had to be brave enough to ask your parents or another adult, and you learned that way, maybe from your peers. And
now they can just Google it.
Now you just Google it and you find more information than you ever need to know.
And porn companies are actively trying to capitalize on the fact that kids are Googling terms, and they're even trying to ensure that younger and younger kids get access. And I'll give you one example. If you want somebody to find your content online, you tag it. Right? So when somebody Googles that term, right, then it leads you to your site. So they've been tagging hardcore porn videos with phrases like Dora the Explorer. So that little kids who are Googling stumble across this stuff. So back in the day, pornography was much harder to get, and parents could sort of assume that, just as you say, they were going to learn what they learned from an older brother or their peers.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't have an active plan to prevent your kids from stumbling across pornography, they absolutely will. About 80% of men in Canada access porn every month.
That's very scary.
Yeah.
That's really scary statistics. And something I'm glad people are starting to look at this.
Yeah.
You said even in the House of Commons they're discussing this and trying to stop it.
Something like 5 American states have now declared porn a public health crisis. In the UK, they've passed legislation demanding that internet service providers have an opt-in option to prevent kids from accessing this stuff. So the really bad news is the problem I just described. The somewhat good news is that the problem is so obvious now to so many people that we're finally starting, I think, to have a cultural conversation about why porn is dangerous and what we can do to keep this stuff away from kids.
And I think a lot of times people don't realize how dangerous it is. They're just looking at pictures, and and then that's the end of it, kind of.
Yeah,
thing.
so that's
I mean, and at the beginning, I guess it probably is. It's what it can lead to, right, further on.
Oh, and that's true for two reasons. It's one, because people who don't want their kids to look at porn don't realize what their kids are looking at because they've still got Playboy in their head.
Right.
The second point is that we're just starting to understand how consumption of this sort of sexual material actually rewires the brain. Because the brain is actually very plastic. There was a great book put out from the University of Toronto a couple of years ago by Dr. Norman Doidge called The Brain That Changes Itself. And he talked about how viewing pornography actually changes the landscape of your brain.
Wow.
And the younger that you look at this stuff, of course, the greater impact it has, because especially, pre-adolescence and then in those early key years, pornography is actually changing what you're attracted to. It's getting these horrible ideas about what it means to be a man and a woman into your brain, and this is something we need to get out ahead of, and that's one of the topics that I started the evening off on.
I see.
On Wednesday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, some of the stuff is it's amazing to me that is actually happening in our world. It's very scary. But I'm glad that it's a start of what's being fixed, and I don't know how you fix it. It's such a massive problem, and the things that like I say, it's the things that it leads to that's so scary. When you look at these little 9, 10, 11-year-olds who shouldn't have a care in the world.
No, they're being robbed of their childhood.
And they're taking away from that. I mean, the childhood is gone when you start into that so over-the-top adult stuff.
Very much so.
Even for adults, it's a little bit too much.
Absolutely.
And when you
it is,
think,
yeah.
an 11-year-old looking at it, and it's scary.
Profoundly impacts them.
Yeah, for sure. So you talked about that. What else came up in your talk?
Well, the second part of the talk, the structure I gave the presentation wasn't the good, the bad, and the ugly. It was the ugly, the bad, and the good to leave people on a little bit more of a cheery note. And I talked about what's going on in this country with the pro-life movement, because what we see, especially at the organization I work for, which is the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, we see dozens and dozens of young people joining the pro-life movement, getting out there on the streets and having these discussions with their peers about what abortion really is, showing them the truth about what abortion is, which is an act of violence that ends the life of a human being developing in the womb. And what we're seeing is tons of people change their mind in response to that truth, and in response to being confronted by their peers who can articulate that truth in a winsome, truthful, and also compassionate manner. So there's a lot of things I think that we can be hopeful for as well, and I see those things firsthand.
That is great news. I mean, the one thing about young people is you can tell them, as an adult, especially as a parent, you can tell them and tell them and tell them and tell them, and it doesn't sit well with them, and they're not going to listen so much. But when their peers start talking about it, that's when it sinks in. That's when it means something, right?
For sure.
I mean, so that's a good thing that young people are getting this message, they're learning from it, and they're spreading the word.
Well, and they're realizing that defending the pro-life position isn't as difficult as most people think. Because it's controversial, people think that it's difficult to talk about.
Right.
But in reality, it's as simple as human beings have human rights. Human rights begin when the human being begins. Science tells us when the human being begins. And so the pro-life position is simply policy informed by the scientific consensus as we've seen it develop over the last several decades. We know that the baby in the womb is a baby. Even the word fetus is Latin for young one.
Right.
And so just getting that information out there to as many people as we can reach.
Right, and the pro-life movement is doing a good job of that.
Yes.
And reaching a huge audience right now, which is good. And that is a good swing on your talk. I'm sure people like to hear that good information after some of the horrific stuff you have to tell.
Yeah.
And you have to say that bad stuff first, because
we have to know what's going on in our own communities.
If you start with the good stuff, it doesn't mean as much as when you say, look at what's happening, but this is what we're doing to combat that.
We don't want people leaving a dinner just feeling completely down in the dumps, right? So you start with, here's what we need to know, this is what we need to be aware of, and then end with, here are some great things that are happening.
And I think you need to hear that stuff first to know just the hugeness of this thing. Because otherwise you're just you're minimalizing it a little bit.
Yeah, very much
You know,
so. No, I agree.
and especially in this type of thing, I think you really do need to, say, you have to lay it on the table. This is what it is.
Yeah, this is what it is.
This is what it is. This is what's happening. But we can do something about it, and that's what you're doing. You've written 3 books.
3, yes.
And the Culture War is the one. Bridget Bittman was on a couple of weeks ago, promoting the dinner that you spoke at, and she was talking about the Culture War.
Yes,
and you've
one.
got that right there. That's your latest one, is it?
No, this is the first one I wrote.
This is your first book. Okay.
This is the one that covers a variety of topics. So it covers the porn plague, hookup culture. It covers extensively the damage that pornography is doing to the social fabric of our culture in our country. But then it also addresses abortion, assisted suicide. It kind of is a one-stop shop to understanding what's actually going on in our country. And then in the last 2 years, I wrote with my colleague Blaise Elaine this book, which is a guide to discussing assisted suicide. And it's basically a simple apologetic for how people can engage with their peers on this issue, which is, of course, very current right now.
I was going to say, there's a lot in the news about assisted suicide right now.
And a lot of people don't know how to discuss it. So this was essentially our offering to people for, if you want to know how to have this discussion with people at your place of work, in your family, here is a very short guide on how to have this discussion intelligently.
And that's, part of the problem with all of this is that people won't speak up or don't know how to speak up about it. So, and that goes for abortion and assisted suicide and the pornography problem. I think the whole thing, it's hard to start the conversation.
And if people are confident in the fact that they can respond to the questions that are posed to them by their peers, suddenly these discussions just start happening. So one of the things that we did when we were working on this book is we went out and we had discussions with people about assisted suicide. All of the arguments we lay out in this book were tested on real people and were actually used to change their mind. So the arguments in this book are what we call peer tested. They've been used to sway people's positions, and so you know that when you're using them, they've worked before. It's not just our idea of how a discussion might go if you took the lead.
Some guy says,
Yeah,
well, that's a good thing too, because it's nice to know that you have spoken to people. It's not just you thought this up and it might work or it might not. And just getting the information out there again is so important. So. Good for you, yeah.
And the last one is called Seeing is Believing, Why Our Culture Must Face the Victims of Abortion. And it's an analysis of how many movements throughout history have confronted deep-rooted injustices and how they've shown the culture the truth about what those injustices were in order to move the culture towards a more just society. So we saw that with the slave trade, with child labor, with civil rights, and what we're seeing now every day in Canadian streets right across the country is that when people see what abortion actually is, they reject abortion. And so this is an analysis of everything we've found on Canadian streets and throughout history just over the last few years.
And Seeing is Believing is a great title. Because
it resonates with people.
It sticks with you. It's something you remember. But it actually is true. Sometimes it's easy to kind of gloss over things. You just read it read it in a magazine or just to see it, hear it in the news. But until you actually, seeing is believing. To see it up close and to understand it and to get a good overview of
We live in a very
everything.
visual culture.
We do.
And if you don't see something, it doesn't impact you.
That's right.
And what we find is that this debate is clouded by euphemisms. So even with assisted suicide, they're not even using the term assisted suicide anymore because people do still have a visceral response to the word suicide.
Of course.
Right? People see it as a negative thing.
Yeah.
So what they're using is the term MAID, medical aid in dying.
Okay.
It's much more, it's softer on the ears, isn't it?
And we like to soften things, don't we?
Yes, we do. We don't want to face the truth.
We tend to soften all those tough subjects, right? So seeing is believing is, putting it out there, without sugarcoating it.
That's exactly it. Yep. Because this happens 300 times every day in Canada.
Every day.
300 abortions every day.
Wow.
But 100,000 a year. And what we have found over and over and over again is that when people see the truth of what abortion actually is, we see them cancel their abortions and we see them decide to choose life instead. And I've met many, many people who have regretted their abortions. I've never met anybody who regretted their baby.
No.
And so it's also the safe choice in more ways than one. And we get to experience a lot of beautiful things by being out there on the streets, using a very ugly truth in defense of a beautiful reality. And that reality is that life is precious.
Life is precious. That's That's so important to remember, you know, and to think about right from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
It's like right from conception.
Yeah, absolutely.
That life is precious. So great words.
Thank you.
Great words. I guess that's why you're the author.
Yeah, I guess so.
Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank
I
you for
really
having me.
appreciate it. Thanks for coming last week and speaking at our banquet as well.
Oh, thank you.
And it was great. We'll have you back on again sometime.
Sounds awesome.
All right, thanks. And thank you for watching today's show. Remember to tune in next week for more Talk of the Town.